The day had been short, one of those pale, silver-lit afternoons where the sun never seemed to climb high enough to properly warm the earth before it began its slow retreat toward the horizon again. You are standing in a strip of farmland, the air sharp in your lungs, the stubbled remains of the autumn harvest poking up from ground hardened by frost. It is the 14th century in rural England, and you are a tenant farmer, one of the countless nameless workers whose survival depends on what little can be coaxed from the land. The first priority, as the light fades, is to see to the animals. They are as vulnerable to the winter cold as you are, perhaps more so, since their survival is not cushioned by the idea of warming oneself by a hearth, but by the body heat they can share with one another in cramped barns. Chickens are ushered into their coops, straw tucked into corners where drafts might creep in. The sheep, wool-thick and matted from the year, are corralled near the shed. Even the family's single cow is led indoors for the night, its bulk a living source of heat against the wind that will whistle through the cracks in the timber walls in the Middle Ages. The idea of indoor warmth was relative. The peasant cottage you return to is a single-room structure, its walls of wattle and door-wooden stakes woven with thin branches, then smeared with a thick mixture of clay, straw, and dung. The scent of the earth walls is familiar, faintly damp this time of year. That dampness is a quiet enemy in winter, creeping into the bones in ways that no fire can quite chase away. Inside, there is little separation between living space and sleeping space. One half of the room contains the open hearth, dug slightly into the earthen floor, its smoke curling upward toward a hole in the thatched roof. The other half is crowded with a rough wooden table, a bench, and the sleeping platform, no mattresses. Only a heap of straw covered by a coarse woolen blanket. Here, everyone sleeps together, not for lack of space, but for the shared heat of human bodies. Privacy is a luxury unknown in this world. As darkness deepens, the cottage becomes the center of your entire world. The rhythm of survival is slow but methodical. A pot is hung over the fire, perhaps with the last of the root vegetables from the autumn store: parsnips, turnips, onions, alongside a small portion of dried peas. A salted piece of pork might be added if the family is lucky this year. There is no scent of rich fat sizzling. The pork has been boiled to stretch its usefulness, its flavor diluted into the broth. This meal is not designed for pleasure, but for endurance. While the stew simmers, you busy yourself with the work that must be done indoors, mending torn clothing with thick linen thread, weaving rushes into floor mats, patching holes in the leather shoes that must last another season. Tools, too, are examined. Wooden handles must be checked for cracks, iron blades wiped clean of rust with an oilcloth. Even in the dim light of the fire, there is no wasting the evening dot. The cottage's lighting comes from two sources: the fire and perhaps a single tallow candle set in an iron holder. The candle sputters, its smoke acrid, the wick curling as it burns down. Tallow, made from animal fat, is far cheaper than beeswax, but its odor is less pleasant, and it must be trimmed often to prevent it from smoking too much. In a household like this, a candle is not lit unless truly needed. Its slow consumption is a reminder of the work it took to make it. The wind outside is beginning to rise now. Through the gaps in the door and the seams of the walls, you can hear it, a low, continuous hiss that sometimes swells into a groan. Snow is not yet falling, but frost will form by midnight. You know from experience that the cold will not reach its cruelest point until just before dawn, when the night has had hours to draw the heat from every surface to prepare for bed. You rake the fire so that its embers will last until morning. In the darkness, you strip down to your linen shift and pull on a second layer, woolen tunic, patched in several places. The blanket, heavy and rough, smells faintly of lanolin. It is not soft, but it traps heat well enough when pulled over. 2 or 3 people lying close together. Sleep does not come quickly on such nights. The hard straw beneath you shifts with every movement, and the small creatures that live in it, fleas, beetles, the occasional mouse, make their presence known. The sound of your own breathing mixes with the breathing of those beside you, forming a rhythm you could count if you wished. If you wake in the middle of the night, you will hear the cow shifting in the corner, the timbers of the roof creaking under the weight of frost and the slow hiss of wind through the thatch. You might reach out and feel the chill of the air above the blanket, cold enough to bite at the skin of your hand. It is tempting to pull the blanket tighter, but you must be careful not to tug too much from the others, for warmth is a communal resource here. And as you lie there, you think about the day ahead, the frozen water pail that must be broken open. With a stick, the ice-crusted fields that will still need tending, the brittle wood that will need to be split for the morning fire. You wonder if tomorrow's weather will be colder than tonight's, and if this will be the winter that takes more from the village than it gives back. Would the night always feel this long if you could not count the hours? Or is it only in winter, when the dark is so deep and the cold so constant, that time itself seems to slow down? The night stretches on in a kind of suspended stillness, punctuated only by the smallest and most ordinary sounds, someone shifting in the straw, a faint cough from the far side of the room, the gentle lowing of the cow when it shifts its weight. Outside, the wind has changed from its earlier restless hiss to a steadier, quieter flow, the kind that makes the thatch above your head tremble faintly in the dark. The human senses adjust. You can smell the lingering aroma of the boiled vegetables, from earlier, faint now, overtaken by the sharper sense of smoke, wool, and damp earth. You can feel the coarse texture of the blanket against your skin, and beneath you, the uneven prick of the straw mattresser, mixture of last summer's hay and rushes gathered from the nearby riverbank. The fire has settled into a dull glow, a mound of embers that pulse with slow, deep breaths of red light. This is the heart of the home in the truest sense, not only a source of cooking and heat, but also a guard against the kind of cold that numbs the fingers, stiffens the joints, and can rob a person of life if left unchecked. You know from experience that a fire left to die entirely during the night would make the morning unbearable. There would be no coals to coax into flame, only the long work of starting a fresh fire with flint and tinder, an effort best avoided when the air inside the cottage is cold enough to see your breath. Many households, including yours, keep a simple pot lid or a flat stone to cover the embers when everyone finally settles. This traps the heat, keeps the coals alive, and ensures that the warmth will last until the first pale streak of daylight. But even with this care, the temperature inside the room drops steadily through the hours. Your clothing is your second hearth. The woolen tunic you wear to bed is thick enough to block the worst of the drafts. Beneath it, your linen shift adds a thin but important layer. Some families keep their winter garments stored away during the warmer months. protected from moths with herbs such as lavender or pennyroyal. You can faintly smell these in the seams, a reminder of summer even as the cold presses close. Your companion's family, perhaps a neighbor's child sent over because their own home is too cold, sleep in a huddle. The youngest is placed between two adults, a living buffer from the chill. You shift carefully to keep from waking anyone, your hands tucking the blanket more securely around your feet. Warmth, once lost, is hard to regain in the depths of a medieval winter night. Occasionally, you hear the faint rustle of movement from outside the cottage. It might be the fox that has been prowling near the chicken coop for the past week. It could also be one of the larger dogs that roam the village edge, hunting for scraps. In the Middle Ages, most villages did not have fences or walls to keep out animals. Only the light of the fire and the scent of human presence offer any deterrence. Still, the doors are barred at night not with complex locks, but with a simple wooden beam slid into place. The hours before dawn are the most testing. Your breath feels colder, the tip of your nose chilled even under the blanket. The fire's embers are dim now, and you must resist the urge to get up too soon to tend them. Movement will expose your body to the cold air and undo the careful layering of warmth you have preserved. You remember older villagers telling stories of winters so hard that men would sleep fully clothed in their boots, afraid that their feet might freeze before morning if they took them off. For warmth beyond clothing and bedding, you sometimes use heated stones. Earlier in the evening, before the fire was raked, a stone was placed near the edge of the hearth to absorb heat. Wrapped in a scrap of cloth or old sack, it can be placed at the foot of the bed to radiate warmth slowly through the night. Tonight, you can still feel the stone's faint heat at your toes, though it is fading when the cold feels particularly sharp. You pull your arms and head entirely under the blanket, breathing into the small pocket of air you've created. This warms your face, though the air becomes thick and damp after a while, forcing you to peek out again for a breath of the room's smoky, frigid atmosphere. Time moves strangely here. Without a clock, you measure the night in the soft cycles of half-sleep, waking briefly to shift position, then drifting off again. You judge the progress of dawn by the changing pitch of the wind and the faintest shift in the quality of darkness, every so often. Your mind wanders to what the rest of the village is doing at this same hour. The Reeves house, larger and sturdier, might be warmer, though even there the night is long. The church stands cold and silent, its stones holding the chill like a deep well. The miller's cottage by the stream will be rimed with frost inside as well as out, the water wheel creaking slowly in the icy current. You think of those less fortunate, the travellers who might be sheltering under a hedgerow, the beggars in town who sleep in doorways, the shepherds who must stay with their flocks in the far fields. For them, the struggle to survive the cold is sharper still, with no roof at all between them and the winter sky. The knowledge that morning will come is both a comfort and a test. When it arrives, the work resumes hauling water that has frozen, solid in its bucket, breaking ice from the trough, venturing into the yard to scatter grain for the chickens. There will be no luxury of staying by the fire, for the day's survival depends on tasks that cannot be postponed. And yet, as you lie in the darkness, you wonder about the nights still to come this winter. The one you are enduring now is early. In the season, January will be worse. Will the stores of food last until spring? Will the blanket hold out without more patches? Will the roof survive the weight of snow if it comes heavy this year? Outside, the wind sighs again, a low, even sound that carries across the frozen fields. Somewhere beyond the edge of the village, a dog barks once, then falls silent. You close your eyes and wait for the first pale wash of dawn, not knowing whether it will bring relief from the cold, or only the beginning of another day much like this one. How many winter nights must a person endure before the memory of warmth begins to fade? When the faintest change comes to the darkness, it is not sudden. It begins as something almost imagined, an easing of the black into a deep, colorless gray. Your eyes, weary from the night, sense it before your mind accepts it. The long night is ending. But this moment, though welcome, does not yet bring warmth. In winter, dawn is more a pale promise than a true deliverance. You shift in the straw, your movements stiff. The joints ache from lying still so long, and the cold has made your limbs slow to respond. The blanket still traps the heat between your body and the others beside you, but you can feel the air beyond its edge has become sharper. At some point, the fire has dwindled almost to nothing. A single ember glows faintly among the ashes, and it will need coaxing before it can give any real heat again. The first task of the morning is always the same: rekindling the hearth. You slip one arm out from under the blanket, shivering as the cold air bites against your skin. Using the poker, you scrape gently at the ash, exposing what few embers remain. A twist of dry straw is laid close, then a fragment of kindling. You blow softly, the breath condensing in the frigid air. The ember brightens, then catches the straw with a tiny crackle. Slowly, the thin flame licks upward, catching on the wood. The smell of burning straw mingles with the lingering smoke from the night before, a scent that means survival as much as it means warmth. Others in the cottage begin to stir, voices low and rough from sleep. The youngest child, huddled between adults, burrows deeper under the blanket as if to postpone the inevitable moment of leaving the warmth. But the day's work will not wait. Even in winter, the village lives by the rhythm of labor. The door is unbarred, a simple wooden beam lifted from its bracket sand. The world outside spills in with a rush of freezing air. The change is instant, biting at fingers and cheeks. The frost has settled thickly during the night. The ground is white and brittle, the thatch of the roof dusted with glittering crystals. You step outside, your boots stiff and the leather cold. Against your feet, each breath forms a small cloud before you, the only motion in a still landscape. The first chore is to check the animals. The cow, shifting restlessly in its corner overnight, must be let out to drink. But the water in the trough is solid, its surface sealed with ice nearly as thick as your palm. A heavy stick or mallet is used to break it, the sound echoing sharply in the crisp air. The chickens are let out, their breath visible too, their feathers fluffed against the cold. They pick at the grain you scatter for them, their movements brisk and mechanical, as though they too understand that every moment in the cold must be met with purpose. Back inside, the fire has grown stronger. A pot is set over it, not for a rich breakfast, but for a thin porridge made from oats or barley. The smell is plain, even dull, but in the depth of winter, such food is not about variety or pleasure. It is about filling the stomach with something warm enough to fuel the next hours of work. You sit near the hearth, holding the wooden bowl close to your face. letting the steam soften the chill in your nose. Once the meal is finished, there is no lingering. Winter mornings bring with them their own list of urgent tasks. A few must go to the woodpile, selecting the driest logs to keep for the next night's fire. Others must check the stored vegetables, ensuring that rot has not crept into the baskets. Salted meats, hanging from the rafters, are inspected for signs of dampness or mold. In a household with so little margin for loss, a single spoiled portion can mean hunger weeks from now. The light outside strengthens, though the sun remains low in the sky. In midwinter, its path is short and its power weak. Shadows stretch long across the frost, and the fields beyond the cottage lie bare and silent. You know that the work here is not about growing. There will be no planting for months yet, but about enduring. Repairs are made, tools maintained, and anything that can be prepared ahead for the coming spring is set in order now. In the middle of the morning, you pass through the village. Thin smoke rises from every chimney, and the sounds are muffled by the stillness of the air. A neighbor greets you, their breath a cloud like yours, their face red from the cold. Everyone shares in this season's hardships, though some households are better prepared than others. The wealthier peasants may have 2 cows, more stored grain, or an extra blanket to their name. But the cold is a great equalizer. No one escapes it entirely. From the church tower, a bell marks the hour. It rings clearly in the frosty air, the sound traveling farther than it would in the damp days of summer. The bell calls not only for prayer, but also for the communal sense of the day beginning. Each person returning to their work with a quiet understanding that they are part of the same struggle as the hours pass. The sun reaches its low peak, its light bright but its warmth faint. By midday, the frost has softened only slightly. You gather more firewood, mending the stack inside to ensure there is enough for the evening. A small bundle of kindling is kept near the hearth, protected from dampness once night falls. No one wants to be fumbling in the dark for wood that will not catch. In the early afternoon, you find yourself pausing, looking out across the pale fields. It is hard to imagine now that they will be green again, filled with the movement of sowing, weeding, and harvest. In winter, the world seems locked in a kind of suspended silence, each day echoing the one before. And yet, this is the rhythm. Your life is built on seasons, dictate everything, and winter's hardships are as much a part of the year as the abundance of summer. By the time the sky begins to dim again, you feel the weight of the coming night. It will be as cold, if not colder, than the one just past. But you are ready. Wood has been gathered, food prepared, the fire tended with care. The blankets, rough and heavy, are shaken out and laid ready. The heated stone will be placed once again at the foot of the bed, and when the darkness returns, you will retreat once more into the small circle of warmth that the cottage can hold. The cold will not be conquered, only endured. And so you wonder, as you watch the light fade from the frost-touched horizon, how many centuries of winter nights like this have been endured by those before you, and how many more will come before the world changes enough that a night's survival no longer depends on the simple skill of keeping a fire alive. You wake to the sound of the wooden clapper echoing down the stone corridors, a dull, rhythmic knocking that is neither urgent nor loud, but insistent in its own quiet way. It is the call to matins, the first of the long night offices, and it means that the monks are already rising from their narrow pallets, shrugging themselves into coarse wool habits, and preparing to make their way to the abbey church. It is winter in the highlands, the kind of deep cold that turns breath into drifting, vapor, and stiffens the joints before the day has even begun. But for the monks, there is no indulgence in staying under the thin blankets for warmth. Their lives are ruled by the divine office, the canonical hours that divide the day and night into fixed times for prayer, and the cold is as much a part of their discipline as fasting or silence. As you step into the cloister walk, the air is heavy with the scent of damp stone and old rush matting. The frost outside has crept into the very walls, giving the impression that the abbey is breathing in the cold and exhaling it back at you. The monks move silently in single file, their sandals slapping softly on the worn flagstones. There is no candle for each brother, only the flicker of a single lantern carried at the front, casting long wavering shadows against the pale walls. It is easy to imagine that nothing has changed here for centuries, and indeed, in many ways it hasn't. In the early Middle Ages, abbeys across Europe followed the rule of Saint Benedict or similar monastic codes, prescribing the rhythm of work, prayer, and rest. The great stone buildings were designed not for comfort, but for endurance both of the structure and of the men inside. As you follow them, your fingers instinctively curl into your sleeves for warmth. The air bites sharply at your cheeks, and every breath seems to carry the scent of distant wood smoke from the kitchens. Though there will be no breakfast yet, the abbey church looms ahead, its doorway a black void in the faint pre-dawn light. Stepping inside, the chill deepens. The building has been standing for hundreds of years, but it has never been warm in winter. The thick walls keep out wind, but they also hold the cold as if it were part of the stone itself. The floor beneath your feet is uneven, smoothed by centuries of barefooted processions. The monks take their places in the choir stalls, their hoods pulled forward to hide most of their faces. There is no fire here, only light comes from the tall beeswax candles on the altar, their flames trembling in the draught. The sound of the first chant rises slowly, like breath turning to mist, the Latin words stretching into the air and fading into the stillness of the nave. You notice how the cold changes sound. Every note seems sharper, more precise, as though the frost itself carries it further. The psalms and antiphons are sung in alternation, one side of the choir answering the other, the rhythm steady and unhurried. To the untrained ear, the chanting might seem monotonous, but to the monks, it is the daily weaving of their spiritual life, each verse a thread in the vast unseen tapestry of prayer that stretches across centuries. In between the chants, there are long silences, not the silence of sleep or idleness, but of attentive stillness. Even in these pauses, the cold does not let you forget itself. You feel it in your toes, your knees, the stiffness of your shoulders. The monks do not fidget. Their discipline is as much about enduring the body's protest as it is about repeating the words of Scripture. When the office ends, there is no rush to leave. The monks file out with the same quiet order in which they entered, their sandals, once again whispering on the stone. The lantern at the front sways gently, the only moving light in the long nave. Outside, the cloister court is rimmed with frost, and the sky has just begun to pale toward dawn. You think of the many winters, that have passed like this, unchanging in their rhythm. For centuries, men have risen from sleep in the deep of night to chant their prayers into the cold air, knowing that tomorrow will be the same, and the day after that, and the year after that, as you watch the line of monks disappear into the cloister walk, you find yourself wondering not about the warmth they lack, or the comfort they never expect, but about the quiet persistence of it all. How many lives have been shaped entirely by the turning of this ancient routine? And what happens to a man's thoughts year after year when the cold becomes not an interruption to life, but a part of its fabric? You are awake again, though you are not sure if you ever truly slept after the midnight vigil. In the Abbey, sleep does not belong to you. It belongs to the hours, and the hours belong to God. The rule governs each moment like the tolling of the bell, never hurried, never delayed, always returning, like the slow turning of the seasons when the vigil ends. The monks return to their narrow cots, though cot might be a generous word. Most beds are little more than rough boards with a thin layer of straw for padding. The straw, in winter, feels as though it has absorbed the cold from the stone floor beneath. There is no blanket for warmth, only a coarse woolen cover that smells faintly of sheep and lanolin. You lie down fully clothed, keeping your habit around you, hood pulled over your head. It traps some of your breath against your face, though soon even that warmth dissipates. Sleep at this hour is shallow. You hear the wind through the cracks in the shutters, the faint creak of beams in the ceiling, and somewhere the shuffle of a brother rising early to tend the fires for the kitchens. You imagine him pulling on his boots in the dark, careful not to wake the others, his breath forming small clouds as he moves along the cloister walk to the hearth room. When the bell rings for Lord's, the second office of the day, the sky outside is still the color of old slate. You rise again, the stiffness in your back reminding you of the hours already spent standing in the cold chapel earlier that night. Each monk moves without speaking, only the soft brush of sandals against flagstones marking the procession toward the choir stalls. The air in the church is sharper now than it was at midnight, for the building has not yet gathered any daytime warmth. The candles from the vigil have long since burned out, replaced now by a few small flames that give just enough light to illuminate the psalter before you. They cast tall, trembling shadows across the ribbed vaults overhead, making the ceiling seem even higher and more unreachable than in daylight. The chanting begins again, slower and heavier than before. Some voices carry a roughness now, not from age, but from the way the cold seizes the throat overnight. The sound echoes against the bare walls, a hollow music that lingers in the rafters. You feel each note in your chest, the vibration mingling with the chill in the air. Once Lord's is complete, there is a short moment before prime, the next office, and then the day's manual labor begins. These small pauses are rarely times of comfort. Most brothers use them to complete small but necessary tasks, mending robes, copying a line or two of text in the scriptorium, or fetching fresh water from the well. The well water, in winter, is almost unbearably cold to the touch, and if the frost has been severe enough, a thin sheet of ice must be broken before the bucket can be lowered. You take it in your hands, and the cold bites instantly, making the skin on your fingers redden and stiffen by the time prime begins. There is the faintest suggestion of daylight at the eastern windows, pale, watery light that offers little warmth but announces that the long night is at last ending. Still, you feel the cold in your bones, in the way your feet no longer quite regain their feeling after hours of standing, and in the slight tremor in your hands when you turn the pages of the book. Morning tasks follow, tending the animals in the abbey's small enclosure, sweeping the cloisters, and carrying firewood from the storage sheds to the kitchen. The wood is damp from the frost, so it must be stacked close to the hearth to dry before it can burn properly. The smoke, as it catches, fills the air with a sharp, resinous scent that clings to the wool of your habit. The cook prepares a thin broth for the morning meal, using preserved vegetables from the previous autumn's harvest. It is not hot enough to warm you completely, but it is the first real heat to touch your stomach since yesterday's supper. You drink it slowly, watching the steam rise and curl in the air. The day has truly begun, but the memory of the midnight vigil lingers, its cold, its silence, its unbroken discipline. And you know that when the sun sets again, you will be called once more to the same dark chapel, to stand in the same cold air, and to let the cycle of the hours pull you back into that rhythm where sleep and waking are not separated by comfort, only by the ringing of the bell. And as you move about the morning's tasks, a question lingers in your mind, one the rule never answers outright. Is the hardship of these vigils meant to humble the body or to awaken the soul? The road that wound its way toward the Alps had begun as nothing more than a faint trail in the frostbitten earth. But by the winter of our tale, it was pressed and hardened by the countless boots, hooves, and wheels of travelers who had dared this route before. The sun was little more than a pale coin in the December sky, and its light fell like cold dust across the shoulders of the men and women trudging slowly upward, each step punctuated by the soft crunch of ice beneath their worn leather soles. The merchants moved in a long, wavering line, like a caravan of shadows stretching between valleys, their breath blooming in ghostly clouds that hung in the thin air before vanishing into the stillness. The air was sharp enough to sting the inside of the nose, and each inhalation seemed to taste faintly of pine, resin, and stone. The mountains loomed in the distance, white-capped, immense, and unmoving, watching the tiny human procession with the same indifference they had shown for centuries. At the front of the line walked Tommaso di Vera, a trader from the lowlands of Lombardy, his cloak patched and heavy with frost where his breath had settled in the fur along the collar. He leaned into the steady slope of the road with a kind of patience only seasoned travelers possessed, his mind quietly counting the bundles in the mule cart that followed, bolts of dyed wool, casks of olive oil, sacks of dried figs, and a small crate wrapped in linen containing delicate blown glass, cups meant for a wealthy family in Basel. Every item was worth the risk, at least in theory, because the profits promised in the markets beyond the mountains were enough to feed his household for half a year. Behind him trudged a small company of fellow merchants, each from a different corner of the continent, bound together by the strange camaraderie that came from facing the same wind-bitten miles. There was Jak, a broad-shouldered German carrying a pack bristling with copper pans, a slender Burgundian woman named Margot, her basket clinking faintly with the sound of ceramic jars, an old peer from Savoy, whose donkey bore a load so swaddled in cloth that no one knew precisely what he sold, though he insisted it was worth more than gold. They spoke little as they walked, for the cold swallowed words almost as quickly as it swallowed warmth. Conversation happened only in the soft glances between them, or in the rare moment when one might murmur a short blessing as another adjusted their pack. The path narrowed as they approached the foothills, the snow deepening where the wind had swept it into drifts against the jagged rocks. The merchants took to walking in single file, stepping in the prints left by the one ahead to conserve energy. The mules snorted and shook their heads, the steam from their nostrils curling into the brittle morning light. Bells tied to the animals. Harnesses chimed dully, a sound both comforting and melancholy, marking their slow progress as if counting the minutes of an unending day. Somewhere above them, the cry of a raven cut across the valley, so sharp it seemed to splinter the silence before fading again into the endless white dot. By mid-afternoon, they paused near a cluster of bare larch trees whose twisted branches rattled faintly in the wind. Here they took their meal, though the word meal was generous. A strip of hard cheese, a crust of bread softened against the steam of a drinking flask, and a mouthful of wine that tasted almost like summer if one closed their eyes. No one lingered, for the shadows were already lengthening and the light was taking on that bluish hue that spoke of snow coming soon. Tommaso glanced upward to where the path disappeared into a cleft in the hills. Beyond that lay the true ascent into the high passes, and he knew the night could be as much an enemy as any bandit or wolf. So they shouldered their packs once more, each step carrying them into air that grew thinner and colder. The pines thinned, the snow thickened, and the sky shifted into the pearly half-light that precedes dusk in the mountains. Somewhere in the distance, hidden in a fold of stone, there would be a shelterer crewed in, or a monastery outpost where they could sleep on straw and warm their hands before a fire of green, smoking pine logs. But for now, the world was only ice, breath, and the sound of boots upon a frozen path. The wind did not greet them as a mere passing inconvenience. It came in the way of a relentless presence, a thing alive with cold intent, hissing through the narrow folds of the mountains as though the pass itself had drawn a long glacial breath. The merchants 8 men, 3 women, a hired guide, and 2 youths bound for apprenticeships in some far-off Lombard city, found themselves in a place where the very air carried a sound like grinding ice. They had risen before the sun, thinking, to gain the heights before midday, when the shadows could lengthen into hazards of their own. But the clouds had gathered more quickly than the most seasoned among them could have guessed. Already the high slopes were cloaked, their jagged teeth of rock vanishing behind a veil of white that shifted and thickened as the storm claimed more of the day. Each step forward became a small act of endurance. The snow beneath their boots had lost its morning firmness and now clung in soft drifts, swallowing their ankles with a sighing weight that made every pace slower than the last. Cloth hoods rhymed with frost. Lashes caught the damp and froze in brittle crescents. The strings of their bundles grew stiff and chafed their gloved hands. No one spoke much, for speech required the parting of lips already sore with cold, and the sound was often lost to the wind's ceaseless voice. The guidon older man, whose hair was so threaded with silver that the snow only deepened its pallor, walked a little ahead, his heavy staff testing the way like a blind man's cane. Sometimes he would turn, his eyes narrowed against the driven flakes, to gesture for the others to keep tight together, like a flock in the care of a watchful shepherd. The narrow pass itself was a long, curving defile between 2 shoulders of the Alps, rising steeply to either side. In summer, The way was hard, but not cruel. One could walk it with a careful step, perhaps pausing to let the mules drink at the rivulets that spilled from the snowfields above. But now, in winter's full grip, it was a place remade by ice and wind, where stones wore caps of white, and every familiar shape was softened into an unfamiliar mound or blade. The cliffs bore long icicles, like crystal lances, some nearly as tall as a man, and where meltwater had once run freely, there were now frozen curtains, opaque and still, sealing the mountain's face. Now and then, the storm shifted enough to show them a glimpse of the drop to their right, a dark, forbidding gulf where the snow vanished into a blur of cloud. One of the younger apprentices, braver in the lowlands, now kept his eyes fixed firmly on the guide's boots, unwilling to look at the depth that yawned so close. Even the mules, their breath streaming in ghostly clouds, seemed uneasy, stepping gingerly and tossing their heads as if to shake away the sting of snowflakes that found their eyes. Bells fixed to the packs gave off only the faintest jingle, muffled by the thick air, a sound so small it felt swallowed almost before it could be heard. Midway through the climb, they found the wind striking from the side, sweeping down from an unseen crest, so that they had to lean into it or be shifted off their narrow line of march. The snow came faster, its flakes no longer light but heavy, clumping together, clinging to wool and hair. In the pauses between gusts, one could hear the faint creak of ice somewhere above, the warning groan of a ledge burdened too long. Each of them knew the stories how one wrong sound could rouse a white wave to fall from above, swift and final, but no one dared voice such thoughts. It was enough to keep moving, boots sinking, breath ragged, following that staff's steady probing in the guide's hand. The smell of the storm was unlike the lowland rain they all knew. It carried no scent of wet earth or growing things, only the mineral temps of stone and the sharp purity of snow that had never touched the soil. It was a smell that belonged to the heights, to places where even the hardiest pines bowed to the wind and vanished. In such a place, the human figure felt impossibly small, mere shadows upon the white. And yet, here they were, hauling bolts of cloth, small barrels of oil, and bundles of spices wrapped in oiled skins. Each item a fragile promise of coin to be earned in towns they could not yet see. When they reached a midpoint of the pass, the guide called a halt. He had found a spot where the slope widened just enough to give a sense of shelter hollow in the lee of a jutting rock, its black face striped with frost. The mules stood with heads low, steam rising from their backs. No fire could be made here, for the wind would snatch the spark before it could take, and so they contented themselves with pulling strips of salted meat from their pouches, chewing them slowly, not for taste but for the strength they might give. Snow settled upon their shoulders as they ate, as if the storm meant to make statues of them all. The older of the two apprentices, his lips cracked and his cheeks raw, asked the guide in a low voice how far it might be to the other side. The man answered with a shrug that was half lost in the folds of his cloak. It could be hours yet, if the wind did not worsen. It could be much longer if the path ahead was buried deeper than the last time he had crossed. Such was the nature of the Alps in winter. They gave nothing freely, not even certainty. And yet, as they rose to go on, there was a kind of quiet resolve among them, the unspoken understanding that each step forward was also a step toward warmth, toward the sound of shutters closing against the night, toward rooms where the air held the smell of cooking and not this endless white breath of the mountains. Their world for now was the narrow ribbon of track beneath their boots, the storm all around, and the sense that the mountains ancient unmoved, merely watched as another small caravan tried to pass beneath their gaze. Still, in such moments, there was a strange beauty, the sight of snow streaming sideways across the air like pale smoke, the silver-grey shapes of the peaks vanishing and reappearing in the shifting veil, the faint glimmer of ice crystals catching what little light the sky still offered. Beauty that did not soften the hardship, but stood alongside it, reminding them that even in the most unforgiving places, the world could still turn the cold into something worth remembering. And so they went on, heads bent, steps sure but slow, into the high pass where winter reigned unchallenged. The worst of the wind had passed sometime in the small, grey hours, though none of them could quite tell when. The mountains keep their own hours, and storms fade according to their own moods. What the merchants knew was that the air, though still cold enough to sting their cheeks, no longer roared with the sound of torn snow. Now, when they looked ahead, the ridge they had been clinging to began to slope first, gently, then with a promise of leading them downward, away from the vast, pale emptiness they had just endured. The pass had been crossed. They were no longer climbing toward the wrath of the heavens, but letting gravity guide them toward something more earthly, the snow beneath. Their boots was no less deep, but it seemed softer here, as if the wind had not bothered to harden its crust. Their mules stepped with something almost like confidence now, their ears flicking forward instead of lying flat against their skulls. One mule gave a brief, ringing snort, and though it was nothing more than breath steaming in the cold, it sounded to the men like a note of reassurance, an animal's way of telling them, yes, there is somewhere to go now. The first sign that they were truly descending was not sight, but scent. It came faintly on the air, the dark, resinous smell of pine trees, still distant but distinct from the dry, frozen smell of the upper pass. It was the sort of scent that made men's shoulders loosen, for it meant shelter, wood for fires, and the thought impossible to keep at bay roofs over one's head. One of the younger merchants breathed deeply, as though the air itself was a draught of wine. No one spoke of it aloud, perhaps out of superstition, as if naming their hope might scare it away. The light, too, began to change. The upper reaches of the pass had been a relentless palette of white and iron grey, the sky a weight pressing down on them. Now there were moments brief, flickering when a shaft of sunlight slipped through a break in the clouds and painted the snow in a softer glow. The merchants' shadows began to return to them, stretching long and blue upon the slope, reminding each man of his own shape after hours of being merely a bundled, faceless figure in the storm, and then so small they almost missed it, the first mark of human hands upon the landscape. Half buried in snow stood a crooked wooden post, its top carved into the shape of a crude cross. No paint remained, if ever there had been any, but the wood had been cut by some long-ago traveller to serve as a marker for those coming down the same way. Its purpose was more than practical. In these mountains, such posts often marked the spot where someone had been found or not found in winters past. The merchants each touched their fingers briefly to the sign as they passed, not out of any formal ritual, but in quiet respect. Lower still, they began to see the dark shapes of trees, stunted, ice-crusted things at first, their branches bent low by snow. But as the descent continued, the trunks grew thicker, straighter, and the green of pine needles emerged beneath their burden of frost. The wind, when it came, was gentler here, carrying the muffled sound of snow dislodging and falling from the branches in soft, heavy thumps. It was a living sound different from the lifeless hiss of wind over the high pass, and it reminded them that the world was inhabited again. Not long after, the slope curved, and in a shallow dip between ridges, they saw it, a thin curl of smoke, so faint it might have been mistaken for cloud. It rose from somewhere far ahead, tucked out of sight behind the tree line. No one needed to say what it meant. The sight of that smoke, human, deliberate, was a thread pulling them forward. The path wound through a stand of evergreens, where the snow lay in dimpled hollows instead of the scoured drifts of the high country. And there, as if conjured from the traveller's longing, appeared the first structure, a low stone hut with a roof thickly thatched and rimmed with icicles. The door stood open, and from within came the glow of a fire so orange and warm that it looked, for a moment, like something from a dream. A man in a fur-lined cap appeared in the doorway, glancing up the path at the sound of their mules' bells. His face was brown with wind and sun, his beard stiff with frost, but his eyes were bright in welcome. "You've come down from the pass," he called in a voice roughened by the cold. The merchants nodded, too tired for words. "Then you'll want the fire. There's bread and broth enough. Come." Inside, the hut smelled of smoke, pine resin, and barley soup. The heat made their faces tingle as it thawed the skin. Outside, the snow still fell in lazy flakes, but here, in the pool of firelight, their journey through the storm already felt like something half remembered, a shadow retreating behind them, while ahead lay the promise of roads that would lead, eventually, all the way to the warmer plains of Italy. The wind outside howled like a long-forgotten spirit, its voice threading through the narrow gaps between planks and thatch, rattling the carved beams of the longhouse with a steady, low groan. The world beyond the walls was a white emptiness, drifted high against the side of the house, blocked all but the smallest chinks of daylight. Here, in the dim glow of tallow lamps and the orange heart of the fire pit, life moved slowly, wrapped in the rhythms of midwinter survival. The air was warm with the scent of smoke, damp wool, and salted meat. Every breath was heavy with it, a mingling of earth and hearth that seemed to seep into the skin. On the wide bench along the north wall, Bjorn sat, mending a worn leather strap with patient, deliberate stitches. His hands were cracked from cold and work, but they moved steadily, almost hypnotically, as though he were not entirely present in the task. Beside him, a fur-clad child was bent over a small wooden horse, pushing it back and forth in the narrow strip of floor between the wall and the firelight, humming some wordless tune. Across the hall, near the shield rack, old Runa was turning a spit slowly, the fat from the roasting meat hissing where it dripped into the embers. Every so often, she muttered under her breath prayers, or perhaps gossip no one else could quite. Here, the longhouse was a single, great room, yet the play of shadow and light, of fire warmth and draught cold, gave it corners that felt like separate worlds. In the far end, closest to the big carved door, a young man scraped ice from his boots with the tip of a knife, the meltwater forming dark spots on the beaten earth floor. Near the central fire pit, where most of the family gathered, the flames snapped and sighed, sending smoke upward to curl against the darkened rafters before escaping through the louver in the roof in midwinter. The days were short and the nights impossibly long. Outside, the snow muffled all sound except the wind, making it seem as if the house were floating in some vast empty silence. Inside, the small noises became the whole world. The clink of a wooden ladle against a cooking pot, the soft thump of a cat leaping onto a fur-covered bench, the faint rhythmic wheeze of the hound sleeping at the foot of the bedboards. Hanging from the beams above were the fruits of summer, labour braids of dried garlic, bunches of herbs gone brittle, and pale nets of onions, bundles of fish, and long racks of cured meat. Every time the door was opened, however briefly, a shiver of frost swept through the room, and people drew their cloaks closer around themselves, as though guarding the precious pocket of warmth that was the household's heart. The evening meal was slow to prepare. Nothing rushed in winter. The women stirred thick barley stew in the great iron pot, adding bits of root vegetables and the last of the dried mushrooms from autumn's gathering. The smell rose in a comforting cloud, rich and earthy. As the scent filled the air, it softened. The expressions of those gathered, each sinking a little deeper into the ease that only a warm fire and a full belly could bring. Outside, the storm grew stronger, the wind's howl deepening. Yet within these walls the world was measured in small human acts. A song hummed to a restless child. A cup of warmed ale passed hand to hand, the scrape of a whetstone over the edge of a seek's. In this longhouse, January was not conquered, but endured together, close and steady. The night came down early and without warning, as if the world beyond the longhouse had been swallowed whole by darkness. The fire pit's glow took on greater weight now, a golden pool at the centre of the hall, drawing every gaze like the sun itself. Shadows grew long and soft-edged, blurring the boundaries between wall and bench, beam and rafter, until the entire house seemed less a place of timber and earth than an island of light, adrift in an endless black sea. Runa finished with the spit, lowered the meat onto a carved wooden board, and began slicing it into slow, deliberate strips. Each steaming slice released a ribbon of fragrant heat that curled into the chill air and mingled with the scent of the barley stew. Bowls of rough clay were passed down the benches, ladled full, and the household ate in companionable quiet. Outside, the wind shrieked and battered the walls, but here it was distant, dulled, like the cry of wolves from far down the fjord. When the bowls were scraped clean and the last of the meat gnawed from its bones, the night's true work began not, the work of hands, but of memory and voice. A small boy tugged at his father's sleeve, whispering something that made the man's mouth twitch into a slow smile. He reached for a carved staff that leaned against the bench, a token not of authority tonight, but of the right to speak. Rose to stand in the light. His voice was deep, carrying easily over the pop and hiss of the fire. He spoke of a winter long ago, harsher even than this one, when the sea froze at the harbour's edge, and the sun did not rise for 3 full days. His words painted the air, the creak of ice-bound ships, the taste of smoked fish on a hollow stomach, the crack of frost splitting the hull of a boat. Faces turned toward him, eyes fixed, hands still. Even the hound raised its head for a moment, as if listening, when his tale ended. There was a brief silence, a space for the story to settle before. Another voice took up the staff. This time it was Runa. her words slower, softer, but edged with something older. She spoke of the gods walking unseen in midwinter, of Odin in a tattered cloak passing among longhouses to test the generosity of mortals, of the wild hunt thundering through the storm-laden sky. Her story wove itself into the night so completely that when a sudden gust rattled the shutters, more than one person crossed themselves or touched the charm hidden beneath their tunic. The rituals followed naturally, as they always did in January. A small dish of stew and a slice of bread were set aside for the wandering dead, placed near the door so they might take it without crossing the threshold. A twist of dried herbs was dropped into the fire with murmured words for protection, the smoke curling upward to vanish into the roof vent. Children, half lulled by warmth and fatigue, were drawn onto laps or wrapped in furs where they might sleep against the steady rise and fall of a parent's breath. The hours lengthened, marked only by the slow collapse of logs into embers and the way people drew closer together as the night deepened. In the far shadows, someone began to hum low, steady, almost like the sound of a ship's hull moving through water. The tune gathered others until it became a wordless chorus, the kind sung not for performance, but for the keeping of spirits. Warm, the longhouse breathed as one, the air thick with firelight and old stories, while outside the storm spent itself unseen. By the time the last voices faded, the night was deep and heavy, the fire a bed of glowing coals. One by one, the household lay down beneath furs and wool, their dreams carrying them through the rest of the dark hours. The longhouse stood unmoving, its beams holding the weight of the snow, its walls guarding the warmth of human breath, and its heart beating with the memory of stories told in the depth of January. The night in the longhouse had been a deep, slow tide, drawing all within its timbered walls into the warm embrace of shared breath and fire. Now, in that mysterious hour when darkness is neither fully gone nor truly present, the air inside the hall was thick with the mingled scents of charred oak, woolen cloaks, and the faint animal musk of furs. The hearth's fire had sunk into a bed of embers, red gold islands in a sea of ash casting a low, pulsing light that rose and fell with the faint draughts creeping through the chinks in the planks. The great roof beams above, blackened from years of smoke, were invisible in the dimness, yet one could feel their weight pressing gently from the darkness overhead. Around the walls, shapes lay bundled under blankets and peltsmen, women, children, all nested in quiet. The longhouse was never fully silent. A cough from the corner, the slow shift of someone turning beneath the furs, the faint snort of a sleeping hound, and the occasional creak of wood adjusting to the cold, all spoke of life continuing in stillness. By the entrance, the thick curtain of woven wool that served as a door was stiff with frost, each thread rimmed with a white rime where the warm, moist air of the hearth had met the icy night outside. Beyond it lay the hard, breathless cold of mid-world of frozen rivers and snow-laden roofs, where even the trees stood as though holding their breath. Inside, however, a pocket of warmth lingered stubbornly, a final gift from the night's fire. Slowly, as if testing the boundary between night and morning, a dim blue light began to seep through the tiny smoke holes high above. It was the color of river ice under clouded skies, cold and pale, yet it brought with it a whisper of the day to come. Those awake enough to notice it often felt a small shift inside her stirring in the bones. a reminder that even in the depth of January, the sun had not abandoned them entirely. Near the hearth, an old woman stirred beneath her heavy pelt. She did not rise immediately. Instead, she lay with her eyes half closed, listening to the longhouse breathe. The rituals of waking in winter were as slow and deliberate as the season itself. There was no rush. The outside world would remain locked in frost until the pale sun crept high enough to make the snow glisten. Rising too early only invited the cold inside one's bones. At last, she pushed back the fur and reached for the iron poker. With a gentle hand, she stirred the embers, coaxing them into a brighter glow. A thin thread of flame curled up, catching on a charred log, and soon a faint warmth began to radiate outward again. In the far corner, a boy stirred, eyes still half, in dreams drawn by the flicker of new firelight. He rose only enough to reach for his woolen cap, pulling it snug before curling back beneath the covers. Others would soon follow in this slow awakening, the quiet padding of bare feet across, the worn floorboards, the pulling on of heavy tunics, the soft slap of water being poured into a wooden bowl for washing. A few voices, low and rough with sleep, would begin to speak, exchanging the first words of the day as though testing their strength after a night of silence. Outside, the crows would call from their perches in the bare branches, their cries carrying far in the brittle air. But for now, the longhouse remained a place between worlds, neither fully in the night nor entirely in the day. The embers glowed more brightly, casting their gentle pulse across the faces of those waking, and the faint blue light at the smoke holes promised that the sun, though still shy, was on its way. It was in these hours, between the end of dreams and the beginning of work, that the people of the longhouse felt the deep heart of winter most keenly, a stillness that seemed to stretch back through generations, to other Januaries, other fires, other mornings, just like this one. The day had been a thin, cold, one pale light spilling over a land scoured by war and stripped bare by the passage of armies. In the west, the last weak flame of the sun was sinking behind the skeletal silhouettes of poplars, their branches stripped of all but a few ragged leaves that clung stubbornly against the wind. The garrison, posted along the outer walls of a crumbling French town, knew this moment well, the hour when day's uneasy comfort gave way to the full hardness of a winter night. The walls themselves were ancient, old stone darkened with damp, their surfaces etched by centuries of frost and thaw, siege and peace. Moss lay frozen in the cracks, brittle to the touch. Below them, the countryside spread away in fields that were now nothing more than hard, frozen clods, and beyond that, the black ribbon of the river, its edges crusted with ice. Somewhere beyond the horizon, English patrols moved like shadows, unseen but never forgotten. The soldiers stood hunched in their cloaks' thick wool, though even that seemed no match for the wind that hissed over the ramparts. Their breath smoked in the air, each exhale curling upward before vanishing into the blue-grey gloom. Most of these men were veterans, accustomed to discomfort. Yet there was still something in this deep cold that made their fingers ache and their faces sting, as though the winter itself had grown weary of humanity and sought to drive it away. At the gatehouse, a brazier burned low, fed sparingly with firewood that had been brought in from some distant coppice weeks ago. The glow was faint, casting only enough light to silver the edges of helmets and the hafts of spears. The men rotated through watch shifts, lingering near the brazier for a few moments before heading back to their positions along the parapet. Each man's boots crunched faintly on the frost-rimed stone walkway, the sound oddly loud in the stillness. Beyond the walls, the night was gathering its strength. The first stars began to prick the sky, hard points of light that seemed almost sharper in winter. From somewhere far out in the fields came the thin, eerie bark of a fox. A long pause, and then only the wind again, sighing low along the battlements. The countryside, stripped of summer's softness, was a dark, sleeping thing now, a sleeping thing that could, at any moment, be disturbed by the movement of enemy troops or the flicker of torchlight where no torch should be. The men spoke little, their words stolen quickly by the air, yet there was a rhythm to the watch, a quiet companionship born of shared hardship. A younger soldier, cheeks red from the cold, shifted his weight and stamped his feet to keep the blood moving. An older one, with a patchy beard and eyes narrowed, against the wind, only gave a small, wry smile, as though to say, "You'll get used to it." Somewhere within the keep, the kitchen fire would be kept smouldering until morning, and the thought of hot broth was enough to keep a man steady on his post. The captain made his round cloak, snapping faintly in the wind. He checked the sentries, one by one, stopping briefly to share a few low words reminders to watch the tree line, to keep ears open for the clink of armor in the dark, to be ready for the trumpet signal should trouble come. And then, without ceremony, he moved on, disappearing into the thickening shadows. The dusk deepened toward night, and the ramparts felt less like a man-made fortification and more like a place grown out of the winter itself, cold spine of stone along which men kept their vigil, eyes scanning the darkness. They were small figures against the immensity of the season, but they held their ground all the same, knowing that somewhere out there in the frostbitten dark, the war waited, silent and patient. The hours after midnight stretched out like a taut bowstring, long and without mercy. The air had thickened into something almost solid. Each breath the soldiers drew felt as if it scraped their lungs with frost. Beneath the pale, pitiless face of the moon, the camp lay silent, but for the occasional clink of chainmail shifting under a man's cloak. The ground was frozen hard as hammered iron, and their boots gave no sound upon it. A faint mist drifted from the nearby river, curling like the smoke of a ghostly fire, and its tendrils reached the palisade where two men stood guard, peering into the darkness as if it might suddenly give birth to an enemy. A layer of frost had settled over the timber of the watchtower's beams, glittering faintly in the moonlight. Each hand that gripped the wood left no mark, the cold too intense to melt even the smallest patch. The soldiers kept their cloaks wrapped close, faces half hidden beneath wool hoods, only their eyes visible, eyes that blinked slowly, heavily. The mind's battle against sleep, as fierce as any with sword or spear. Somewhere beyond the black tree line, an owl called, its voice low and hollow, echoing in a way that made the night seem larger, emptier. From the far end of the wall walk, a faint crunch of steps approached Pia, the youngest on duty tonight, carrying a bucket of hot stones wrapped in rags to warm the hands of the two men at the gate. Steam rose faintly from the bundle, though the heat was already fading. "They'll be cold in minutes," one of the older men muttered, not unkindly, as he reached for a stone. He held it against the crook of his arm for a moment, closing his eyes, feeling the ghost of warmth seep through his sleeve before it was stolen away by the air. Overhead, the moon sank lower, its light gaining that peculiar steel blue cast it. Took in the deepest part of winter nights. Shadows lengthened across the empty ground outside the palisade. The soldiers knew that the enemy was unlikely to come in such bitter weather, yet the very stillness made them uneasy. Any sound carried far too far. Somewhere deep in the forest, a branch cracked, sharp as a musket shot. Every head turned toward the sound, though no movement followed. The forest kept its secrets, as it always did. In the far corner of the camp, a brazier burned low, casting a trembling orange light on a circle of men hunched close to it. Their breath mingled in the air, and they spoke in low voices about nothing, of importance about wives and sisters, about the price of bread in their home villages, about the taste of cider they'd had last autumn. These scraps of conversation were not meant to pass the time so much as to remind each man of life beyond the frost and the waiting dot above. The stars were sharp and cold, unblinking. Somewhere in the east, the faintest paling of the sky hinted. That morning was on its long approach, though the cold was only just reaching its cruelest pitch. Until then, the moon's light ruled over the soldiers' thoughts, sharpening every edge of fear and making the night seem endless. It began as the faintest thinning of the blackness in the east, a suggestion rather than a promise, as if the sky were breathing in before speaking. The moon still clung to its dominion, pale and cold above the treetops, but its light was losing that knife-edge sharpness, softening against the first intrusion of day. The men on the wall knew it before they saw it. Some instinct born of 100 such vigils told them that the night had turned, that the slow, invisible wheel of hours was rolling toward the moment when darkness loosens its grip. The frost was heavier than it had been all night. Every surface helm, bow, the leather thongs of a spear's grip was rimmed in white, delicate and glittering. When a man shifted his weight, the frozen timber beneath his feet creaked softly, as if reluctant to yield to movement. The mist from the river had thickened in the last hour, its fingers curling through the lower parts of the camp like an old thief slipping between houses. It clung to boots, to the hems of cloaks, and it muffled sound in a way that made each voice seem nearer than it was. At the main gate, Jacques leaned on the haft of his pollen, gazing toward the east. His eyes were red with weariness, but there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing the worst of the night had passed without alarm. Beside him, Pierre stifled a yawn with the back of his mittened hand. He was shivering less now, though whether from the easing of the cold or from simple numbness was hard to say. Somewhere behind them, the first muted clatter of morning activity began. A cook stirring embers in the kitchen fire pit, the dull ring of a pot being set down, the faint rustle of canvas as men turned in their bedrolls above the camp. The sky deepened from black to a bruised violet, then to a pale, wintry grey. A single thin streak of rose appeared low on the horizon, so fragile it might have been a trick of the eye. Yet it grew, almost imperceptibly, as if the day were unfolding a long-kept letter. With it came a change in the air, not warmer, exactly, but less sharp, less inclined to cut at the lungs. The river mist began to catch the new light, glowing faintly as it drifted dot from the far side of the enclosure. A sentry gave a low call just to words carried in the stillness. It was not an alarm, merely a greeting passed along the wall, a sign that the men had made it through without sighting so much as a shadow of an enemy. That call travelled from watch to watch, each man answering in turn, until it reached the gate, and faded into the dawn. As the light strengthened, the camp stirred more fully. A soldier emerged from a low tent, drawing on his jerkin with stiff, half-frozen fingers. Another crouched beside the brazier, coaxing it into life with a handful of twigs and a patient breath. The smell of smoke thickened, curling up into the paling sky. In its warmth, the frost on helmets and spears began to weep, droplets forming and sliding down in slow silver trails. By the time the sun's first rim broke the line of the trees, the men who had kept watch through the long night were stepping down from the wall, their faces drawn but faintly relieved. The danger had passed, at least for now. In the clear, brittle air of morning, the memory of the night's unease seemed almost like a dream, though each man knew it would return with the next moonrise. Such was the rhythm of the war: darkness, frost, and the quiet endurance of those who kept it at bay. The wind had been rising since dusk, a long, unbroken sigh that rolled over the dark shoulders of the Welsh hills, combing through the wiry grass and bending the winter-browned heather. The shepherd pulled his thick woolen cloak tighter about his shoulders, the heavy folds smelling faintly of lanolin and wood smoke from the hearth he had left behind in the stone cottage miles down the slope. He could feel the dampness of the air settling into his bones, a fine mist clinging to his beard and hair until it sparkled faintly when the moon broke through the clouds. Somewhere in the near distance, the sheep huddled together, low, soft, shapes in the half-light, their breath rising in ghostly plumes into the frosty air. He could hear the faint shuffle of their hooves in the grass, the occasional muffled bleat that was more reassurance than alarm dot above. The sky was a restless shifting of deep cloud and pale, polished moonlight. When the moon found its way free, the moors gleamed in long streaks of silver, the frost coating the tussocks, catching the light as if the hills were dusted in powdered glass. When the cloud closed again, all the world fell back into a heavy, dim shadow where the wind was the only movement, the only voice. The shepherd stood still on a ridge, his staff planted in the earth, listening, not just for the wolf or the wandering dog that might threaten his flock, but for the strange, deep silences of the moor itself, the kind of silences that pressed close and made the heart beat a little quicker. In the far distance, a barn owl gave a single low screech as it passed overhead, wings go spell in the moonlight. The sound faded quickly into the wide emptiness. Down near a hollow, a small stream moved under a thin skin of ice, the water whispering faintly beneath, as though telling secrets to the frozen earth. He knew these sounds, and he took comfort from them, markers in the dark, proof that the night had not closed entirely upon him. The sheep shifted again, and one shook itself. Sending a fine rain of frost from its back, he began to move among them slowly, the long curve of his cloak swinging round his boots. He murmured as he passed, low words in the old tongue, not for their meaning but for the sound, a soft hum that kept the animals calm. His 2 dogs crouched low to the earth, eyes glinting faintly in the dark, paced quietly at the edges of the flock. Now and again one would lift its head to catch the wind, ears twitching towards some distant, inaudible motion. The night stretched on, and time seemed to loosen its grip out here minutes, and hours blending into the steady breathing of the sheep. The sigh of the wind, the muffled tread of the shepherd's boots. Far to the east, the cloud thinned, and for a moment the stars shone cold and sharp as cut ice. The shepherd lifted his eyes to them, feeling their age, their endless watching, and then lowered his gaze again to his flock, his task, the small circle of warmth and life that was his charge in the vast waiting dark. Asterisk, asterisk, by the time midnight drew near, the moor had changed its face. The wind had softened to little more than a wandering breath, and in its absence the mist thickened first as faint, curling wisps among the tussocks, and then as a slow-moving tide that wrapped around the legs of the sheep and smudged the lines of the land, the familiar markers, the ridge, the stream, the distant shape of an old stone wall faded into pale suggestion. Sound was dulled too. The bleats of the flock were muted, as though they reached his ears through cloth. The shepherd shifted his weight and drew his cloak tighter. The cold now was a still, waiting cold, the kind that slid in under the wool and rested against the skin like a hand. The dogs moved more slowly, their bodies low, fur beaded with moisture from the fog. Every so often, one would vanish into the mist entirely and then reappear a few steps later. Ghostly shapes that seemed almost like the half-remembered creatures. Of old tales it was in such nights, when the earth seemed close and far all at once, that the mind drifted to the old stories, the ones his grandfather had told by the peat fire, when the wind outside had screamed over the hills and the walls of the cottage trembled. Stories of the gwilgi, the spectral black dog with eyes like red coals, said to roam the moors at night, following lone travellers until they vanished. Or of the canwyll corph, the corpse candles, faint blue flames that flickered in the dark, and foretold death in the village below. He had laughed at such things when the fire was warm and the door was barred against the dark. But out here, in the hush of the mist, he could not help but glance over his shoulder now and then, watching for a glimmer of something that should not be there. His boots made almost no sound on the frost-softened grass. Somewhere beyond sight, a curlew cried a long, tremulous call that rose and faded like breath in cold air. The shepherd paused, listening, half expecting the cry to be answered by some other, stranger voice. But only the fog replied, pressing closer, thick enough now that he could see the moisture hanging in the beam of his small horn lantern. The light pooled weakly at his feet and caught on the breath of the nearest sheep, making each exhale look like a wisp of pale smoke. He found himself counting the sheep without meaning to, the rhythm of the numbers steadying his mind. But every so often, his thoughts would stray to shapes he might glimpse at the very edge of sight, a shadow among the mist that moved too quickly, or the brief glint of eyes low to the ground before vanishing again. The dogs gave no alarm, yet they too seemed watchful, ears twitching to sounds he could not hear. He thought of the oldest story of all, the one that said the moor itself had memory, that it could draw in the unwary and keep them wandering until dawn or until they were lost forever. That was why, the elders said, you always kept moving, always spoke softly to your flock, and never let your mind wander too far into the mist. The shepherd let his voice drift out again, low and steady, as much for himself as for the sheep. The hours passed like that measured in footfalls, in the muffled snort of a away, in the soft padding of the dogs through grass gone slick with fog. Somewhere high above, unseen, the moon kept its watch, and the mist moved like a slow tide across the sleeping moor. It began almost imperceptibly, a thinning of the blackness, a loosening at the edges of the night. The shepherd noticed it first in the way the mist shifted its color, no longer the deep inky gray of midnight, but a paler silver, as though some hidden light was stirring behind it. The air itself seemed to change, growing less heavy, as though the moor had taken a long breath in the dark and was now letting it go. He stood on a low rise, boots sunk into the damp turf, and watched. As the east began to brighten, the change was slow, the kind that could be missed if one looked away for too long. The horizon, what little could be seen through the gauze of fogs, fonned into faint layers of pearl and faint rose, colors too delicate to name. The sheep, who had moved like pale ghosts through the night, were now more clearly themselves. Their wool caught the first hints of light, faint halos around their backs, and the shapes of their heads became sharper. The dogs, too, looked less spectral, though their coats still gleamed with droplets. They seemed more grounded, their watchfulness easing into quiet readiness. Somewhere far off, a lark began to sing. Its voice was a thread of brightness, fragile, but certain, winding upward through the mist. The shepherd lifted his head, listening. That song meant the long night was nearly over. It was a sound older than the stories, older even than the stone fences that lay half hidden in the grass. The moor itself looked changed, though he could not say exactly how. In the night, it had been a place of blurred edges, of uncertainty and half-glimpsed things. Now, even through the lingering fog, it felt gentler. Its hollows and rises revealed in soft grey contours, the stream showing itself in a glint of pale water here and there. Even the frost underfoot seemed less brittle, its sharpness dulled by the mild, damp air of morning. He let his eyes travel to the west, where the mist was still thickest. For a moment, he thought he saw the faint suggestion of movement there, something slipping back into the shadows before the daylight could catch it. Perhaps it was only a drifting patch of fog shaped by the breeze, or perhaps it was one of the old night things retreating to whatever place it waited out the day. He did not dwell on it. Instead, he began to gather the flock, his voice low but lighter now, carrying farther in the waking air. The dogs moved with him, circling in steady arcs, guiding the sheep toward the path that would take them home. As they moved, the rising sun worked its way deeper into the mist, turning the air to gold in places, silver in others, so that it felt like walking through some great glowing veil. By the time the first rim of the sun lifted above the far ridge, the shepherd had the flock in sight of the lower meadows. The village chimneys would soon be sending their own pale trails into the sky, the smell of peat smoke reaching out over the fields. The night had left its mark on the damp hem of his cloak, on the glistening wool of the sheep, and perhaps, in quieter ways, on his thoughts. But now the day was here, and the moor in the morning light was a different country altogether. The wind had risen steadily all afternoon, until by dusk it was a living thing whistling through the cypress trees, shaking loose sheets of snow from their branches, and moaning against the shutters of the monastery. The pilgrims, weary from days of trudging through white hills and narrow valleys, had arrived at the gates just as the last colour bled from the sky. The gatekeeper, a stooped monk with a face like carved walnut, had admitted them wordlessly, leading them into the cloister's inner court, where the snow swirled in softer spirals, caught in the shelter of the stone walls. Inside, the monastery was dim and warm. Long corridors lined with worn benches stretched away into shadow, and the smell of wood smoke, candle wax, and something faintly spiced hung in the air. The monks moved quietly, their sandals whispering over the flagstones, their cowls pulled low. The pilgrims were shown to a large refectory where a fire roared in an open hearth, its light trembling on the beams above. They ate simply bowls of thick lentil stew, dark bread with a crust that cracked under the fingers, and mugs of steaming broth whose heat seemed to melt the frost from their bones. Conversation was low, scattered murmurs in different dialects of Italian, punctuated by the occasional laugh, quickly hushed out of respect for the solemn air of the place. Snow battered the windows, soft thuds, muffled by the thickness of the glass. Outside was a world erased by white. Inside was a pocket of colour and life, the flicker of firelight on a pilgrim's woolen hood, the glint of a rosary bead, the faint gold paint on a crucifix at the far wall. Later, the monks led them to the dormitory, a long, echoing hall lined with narrow cots, each with a folded blanket at the foot. The air smelled faintly of pine. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and high above, unseen rafters seemed to vanish into shadow. The pilgrims settled in slowly, loosening the straps of their travel packs, unwinding scarves stiff with frost, rubbing warmth into fingers. One man knelt at the foot of his cot, whispering a prayer. Another stared at the frost-framed window, watching snow drift like pale feathers under the moonlight. Somewhere far away in the monastery, a bell tolled the hour. The sound rolled through the stone like a slow heartbeat. It felt less like an announcement of time, and more like a reminder that the world beyond these walls was still turning, though for now, in here, the pilgrims were in a place set apart. A place where winter was not an enemy, but a quiet, relentless presence, pressing against the walls. Asterisk, asterisk, the night came down like a weight, a velvet dark silence that was not silent at all. For though the world beyond the monastery walls lay hidden in snow and shadow, the wind had found 1,000 secret paths through its own musical sighs that wound around the eaves. Sudden rattles at a loose shutter, faint hollow moans slipping down the chimney, and through it all the steady sift of snow falling, each flake landing softly upon the world, yet together forming an unrelenting murmur that filled the spaces between the louder sounds, like the slow, endless turning of an hourglass. The dormitory was nearly dark, save for the faint glow of the banked hearth at its far end. The embers pulsed a quiet orange, their light flickering across the low rafters and catching on the metal of buckles, the sheen of a leather strap left on the floor. The cots were lined in 2 rows along the walls, each with its own narrow strip of privacy. Yet the closeness of the air and the creak of a restless sleeper's movement reminded them all that they were sharing not just the hall, but the long winter night itself. Some had fallen asleep quickly, exhaustion overtaking them as soon as they lay down. They slept heavily, their breathing deep and rhythmic, a slow tide of sound. Others, though, lay on their backs, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, the day's journey still in their bones. Their minds wandered the narrow mountain roads they had travelled, recalling the half-frozen streams, the grey valleys dotted with sheep, the sudden gusts that had driven ice into their eyes. Here in the warmth they could almost feel the snow melting from their lashes. Yet the memory lingered. The youngest pilgrim, a boy of perhaps 17, was one of those who could not sleep. His cot was nearest the small arched window at the end of the hall, and from where he lay he could see the snow falling in the courtyard. It glowed faintly under the pale light of the moon, though the moon itself was hidden behind racing clouds. He watched the flakes spiral down, each one briefly illuminated before vanishing into the deeper whiteness below. He thought of his home, far to the south, where, even in winter, the olive trees stood green against the hills, and where snow was something spoken of but never seen, somewhere deeper in the monastery. Beyond the dormitory door, footsteps moved along the stone corridors, deliberate steps in soft sandals. The boy imagined a monk making his nightly rounds, checking that the candles were extinguished, that the fires were safe, that the chapel door was secure. The sound passed and faded into the hush, replaced by the faint crack of the wood in the hearth as it shifted and settled. Another pilgrim, a woman with a shawl drawn up over her head, lay awake thinking of the road still ahead. She had come from Lucca, and her feet still carried the ache of days of walking. She had meant to sleep, yet the storm outside seemed to press itself against the walls, each gust of wind carrying some half-heard whisper that made her strain to listen. She thought she could hear the bells from the monastery's chapel, but when she lifted her head, there was nothing, only the steady hiss of the snow in the cot beside her. A merchant from Genoa stirred and sighed, his dreams troubled. He muttered in his sleep, words thick with dialect, perhaps speaking to someone he had left behind or bargaining with some imagined buyer. The woman turned on her side, pulling the blanket tighter round her shoulders. The air in the dormitory was cool despite the fire, and each breath came out in a faint white wisp before vanishing. From somewhere down the hall came a soft cough, then another, followed by the creak of a cot frame as someone shifted. For a moment the sounds seemed louder than they were, amplified by the stillness, before they sank back into the vast quiet of the place. The monastery itself seemed to breathe, the old timbers expanding and contracting with the change in temperature, the stone holding the cold in its heart. Every now and then, a deep shudder passed through the walls as a gust slammed against them, making the shutters tremble. A faint dusting of snow slipped in at the ill-fitted edges of one window, settling silently on the sill dot in the refectory below. A monk kept the night watch beside the great hearth, feeding it with slow, measured hands. His rosary beads clicked softly as he prayed, the words murmured into the firelight, their echoes wandering through the cloisters. Occasionally, the bell in the tower would toll the passing of an hour, low and resonant, the sound threading through the night and into the ears of those half asleep in their cots. The young pilgrim by the window closed his eyes, trying to match his breath to the rhythm of the bell's fading hum. Yet sleep would not come. He thought instead of the mountains they had crossed, how the snow had blinded him until all the world had been white and sky, with no line between. He wondered if more snow would fall before morning, if the path ahead would be lost entirely, forcing them to wait here for days. A strange part of him hoped it would. There was a peace in this stone-walled place, a sense of being sheltered from time itself. The storm strengthened near midnight. The wind rose to a long howl that wrapped around the building and seemed to pull at it, as if testing the strength of its foundations. The shutters rattled, the roof groaned under the weight of snow, and once there was a hollow thud somewhere above, though something had slid from the tiles into the courtyard. The boy at the window could see nothing but a blur of white now, the moonlight swallowed by clouds. The courtyard a blank sheet. A few pilgrims stirred uneasily in their sleep, perhaps feeling the cold seep more deeply into the hall. The woman from Luca pulled her shawl over her head entirely, retreating into darkness. Somewhere at the far end of the dormitory, a man's voice spoke briefly, a low murmur, before lapsing into silence again. The hours passed slowly. Those awake counted, them in the toll of the bell, in the creak of the timbers, in the soft shifting of the fire's embers. The snow thickened still, a relentless fall that buried the courtyard deeper and deeper, smoothing over every line, every footprint left from the day before, by the hour before dawn. The storm began to ease, the wind dropping to a quieter sigh. The snow fell straight down now, without swirling, each flake distinct in the faint moonlight that returned as the clouds thinned. The young pilgrim at last closed his eyes, his breathing slowing, the image of the white courtyard fading into dream. Yet still, the monastery's night watch continued, silent feet on stone, a hand adjusting a shutter, the faint scent of pine, logs rising from the hearth below. The night was not yet over, and beyond these walls winter still waited, deep and patient, for the first grey of morning. It began not with light, but with the faintest thinning of the dark, something almost imperceptible at first, as though the night itself were loosening its long black cloak, letting the folds slip toward the horizon. In the narrow guest cells of the monastery, the Italian pilgrims stirred in their sleep, some only half waking, unsure if the dim change pressing at their eyelids was real or merely part of some dream of fields and sunlit valleys far below the mountains. The air was still cold enough to sting in the lungs, and each exhalation left a pale, ghostly thread above the straw-stuffed pallets. Somewhere beyond the walls, a soft, shushing sound moved with the faint wind, the storm's voice now grown quiet, as if all its violence had been spent in the long night. One pilgrim, the eldest of the group, a man whose beard was salted more with age than with frost, blinked himself fully awake and turned toward the small window set into the thick stone wall. It was little more than a slit, glazed in places with ice, but even through it he could see the change. The sky beyond was not black now, but the color of cold milk, faintly blue at the edges, and the uppermost tips of the snowdrifts had begun to glow faintly, as if some buried light were welling up from beneath them. The monastery was waking, though it did so without haste. Somewhere in the deep corridors, a heavy wooden door groaned on its hinges, and a faint shuffle of sandals whispered across the flagstones. The monks, bound by centuries of ritual, moved toward the small chapel for the first prayers of the day. Their voices had not yet begun, but the air itself seemed to hum with the anticipation of chant. The bells would not ring just yet, their sound would carry far in the thin mountain air and wake those still wrapped in sleep. But already the walls seemed to breathe differently, as though the very stones recognized the approach of morning. The pilgrims, stretching stiff limbs under their woolen blankets, became aware that the sound outside the window was no longer a restless wind, but the muffled stillness of snow lying deep and undisturbed. It had piled high in the cloister garden overnight, pressing its soft weight against doors and windows, and now it seemed to hold the world in a gentle hush. The storm had remade everything. Even the air smelled cleaner, sharper, as though each breath carried the cold perfume of pine forests buried somewhere under the white. When at last the monks entered the chapel, the first notes of their chant rose and curled through the air, weaving between the wooden beams of the ceiling and slipping out into the snowy courtyard. The sound was slow, deliberate, unhurried, a human warmth moving through the cold stone. One by one, the pilgrims found themselves sitting upright, listening. Some crossed themselves. Others simply closed their eyes and let the sound work its way into the quiet places of their minds. The words were Latin, yet their meaning seemed to belong to something older than language, something that reached past understanding and into the marrow. Gradually, light began to gather more fully at the windows. What had been a dim blur became sharper, revealing the world beyond. The rooflines of the monastery buildings were heavy under thick white caps. The cloister's arches framed small, sculpted heaps of snow. The mountains beyond the walls stood shrouded in an almost luminous mist. Here and there, from the eaves, long icicles caught the pale dawn and fractured it into tiny shards of silver blue. The pilgrims, now fully awake, began to move about their chamber. The younger ones pulled on boots stiff with cold, their breath hanging in the air like smoke, while others took the chance to stand at the narrow windows and gaze at the changed world. It was as if the night had swept away every blemish and imperfection, leaving behind only a kind of fragile perfection that would last until the day's footsteps and work began to disturb it. In the refectory, the brothers had begun to lay out the morning meal: dark bread with a crust that crackled when broken, bowls of steaming broth, and a pot of something hot and herbal whose scent drifted down the hallway to the pilgrims' quarters. The smell alone seemed to invite motion, and soon the visitors were filing quietly along the corridor, their own footsteps joining the slow rhythm of monastery life. At the doorway to the refectory, a lay brother greeted them with a nod, his hands red from the chill, but his face warm with the easy hospitality of men accustomed to sheltering travelers. The pilgrims entered, their eyes catching on the great windows at the far end of the hall. Through them, the dawn was now a living thing, soft gold and pale rose spilling across the snow-covered courtyard, catching on the stone and timber, making the frost sparkle as though the monastery had been dusted with some celestial powder. They sat at the long wooden tables, and for a time there was only the sound of eating, the low clink of wooden spoons against earthen bowls, the occasional clearing of a throat. Outside, a faint breeze carried a swirl of loose snow from the roof, the flakes dancing briefly before settling again into stillness. It was a reminder that, though the storm had passed, the mountains still held winter in their deep grasp. When the meal was done, some of the pilgrims lingered at the windows, reluctant to turn away from the sight. Down in the valley, though none could see it from here, roads would be blocked, rivers slowed beneath ice, and villagers waiting for messengers to bring word from the high passes. But here, within these walls, there was only the slow turning of the day toward its work, and the knowledge that for at least one more sunrise, they were part of the monastery's quiet breathing. The bells finally rang, their notes rolling out over the snow like ripples on a frozen pond. The sound seemed to bless the morning, acknowledging the night's transformations. And as the pilgrims stepped out into the cloister after the meal, their boots sinking into the fresh drifts, they felt the strange mixture of being both far from home and entirely at peace, as though the world just for this morning had made a place for them. The sky, now brighter, showed hints of pale blue between the drifting clouds. Somewhere beyond the peaks, the sun was lifting, slow and deliberate, sending its light spilling down into the valleys. And here, high in the snowbound monastery, the pilgrims began to move through their day, carrying with them the quiet blessing of a dawn that had remade the earth while they slept. You arrive in the fading light of a winter afternoon, trudging up the slow incline of a frost-crusted path that winds toward the looming silhouette of the keep. The air is thin here in the highlands. Your breath rises in steady clouds before being whipped sideways by a wind that feels as though it has been sharpened on the stones themselves. The year might be the late 14th century or perhaps the early 15th, but the exact date matters little in the highlands, where change moves as slowly as the heather creeps across the hills. The keep itself is not grand in the way the southern castles of England or the Loire Valley might be. It is squat, compact, and built entirely for function. No elaborate turrets, no ornamental flourishes, only bare stone walls, some 15 feet thick at the base, tapering slightly as they climb upward. The stones are irregular, set without the precise geometry of finely dressed masonry. They are bound together with lime mortar that has long since weathered to a pale grey, giving the impression of something older than it truly is. To those who live here, these walls are not architecture, they are survival itself. As you draw nearer, you notice how the entrance is tucked into a sheltered corner, facing away from the prevailing winds. The path funnels you toward a narrow bridge across a shallow ditch, hardly a moat, but enough to deter carts or horses from charging directly at the gate. The wooden door is studded with iron rivets, its surface weathered to a deep, almost black hue by centuries of rain. There is no portcullis. Such things belong to richer strongholds. Instead, a stout oak beam, as thick as a man's thigh, can be slotted across the inside to secure the keep for the night. When you step inside, the first sensation is not warmth, but a sudden absence of wind. The air is still and slightly damp, carrying the faint, lingering scent of peat smoke. Your eyes take time to adjust. The interior is dim light, comes only from narrow arrow slits and the flicker of rushlights mounted in iron brackets along the wall. You are in what might be called the lower hall, a broad but low-ceilinged chamber where the day-to-day life of the keep unfolds in its most practical forms. To one side, there is a stack of firewood much smaller than you might expect for the coming winter months. Peat, rather than wood, is the main fuel here. The bogs surrounding the keep have been cut into long trenches over the summer, each block of sod stacked and dried in the weak highland sun. Now those dried peat bricks are stored in covered sheds just beyond the inner wall, brought in each day to feed the hearth. Peat does not burn with the brightness of wood, but it smoulders steadily and produces a heavy, lingering heat that seeps into stone and bone alike. The walls inside are bare, save for a few practical hangings. Blankets used less for decoration and more for insulation. They hang loosely, forming pockets of trapped air that slow the relentless seep of cold through the stone. This, you realize, is not the kind of castle where tapestries are hung for beauty. Everything here has its function. In the center of the hall is a large, open hearth. It is not built against a wall, but set into the floor, so that smoke can rise directly up through a square opening in the ceiling, where it will be drawn away by a vent in the upper hall. This arrangement warms not only the lower space, but also the rooms above, though warm in this context is a relative term. In winter, even standing beside the hearth, you will never truly feel hot. At best, you will feel less cold. The people of the keep move slowly in the dim light, wrapped in thick woolen plaids that serve as both garment and blanket. Wool here is coarse homespun from the sheep that graze the thin grass of the surrounding hills. It itches against the skin, but that discomfort is nothing compared to the bite of the highland wind. Beneath the plaid, a linen tunic offers another layer, though it is often patched and worn from years of use. Clothes are not changed daily. Laundering in winter is rare, for water is drawn from a stream that may be frozen and drying wet garments. In this climate can take days. You are ushered toward the inner steps, a spiral staircase built into the wall itself. The treads are uneven and steep, designed more to slow an attacker than to offer comfort. Each turn spirals clockwise upward, favoring a right-handed defender who could swing a sword down at anyone ascending. Your hand trails along the central newel, a cold, worn column of stone. The air grows cooler as you climb, for the stairwell is little more than a wind tunnel in winter. Emerging into the upper hall, you are met with a space both more open and yet still austere. The upper hall is the keep's main gathering place, where meals are taken, disputes are settled, and the lairdiff present receives guests. At one end stands a raised dais with a sturdy wooden table and chair. At the other, a smaller hearth, its flames guarded by a blackened iron screen. The floor is strewn with rushes mixed with dried herb-sweet gale, meadow-sweet and mint-knot for luxury, but to mask the damp, animal smells that accumulate in a building shared by people, livestock, and smoke. Around the edges of the hall are benches, chests, and a few simple trestle tables. There are no cushioned seats, only wooden forms covered with folded plaids. Any softness must be brought with you. The windows are nothing more than narrow slits, their openings covered in oiled parchment to keep out the worst of the wind. Glass is far too costly and fragile for a Highland keep. You notice that the walls here are thicker still than below, their splayed interiors revealing just how much stone you are living inside. Those walls keep the wind out, but they also hold the cold in. Without the heat of the hearth, the air would be near freezing, as the light fades entirely outside. The keep is lit by a combination of the hearth's glow and the dim, wavering flames of tallow candles. Tallow, rendered from mutton fat, burns, with a faint, almost acrid scent. Wax candles are rare here, reserved for the chapel or for the laird's private chamber. The evening meal is simple but sustaining. Oat bannocks baked on a griddle over the fire, a broth of barley and root vegetables with a little salted meat, and perhaps some dried fish brought inland from the coast. The food is served in wooden bowls, with spoons carved from horn. There are no forks. Those are a continental novelty. You drink from shared wooden quachers, passing them from one hand to another. Every movement, every object, every bite of food in this keep tells the same story. Life here is built around endurance. The walls are not cold because the people cannot make them warm. They are cold because they are designed to withstand siege, to survive storms, to last for centuries. Comfort is a luxury. Survival is the priority. And yet, as you sit by the fire, wrapped in plaid, watching the shadows ripple along the stone, you begin to wonder, what would it truly feel like to pass not just one evening, but an entire winter within these walls, when the wind howls for months on end and the snow buries the hills outside? Would the stone be a shield, or would it slowly become a prison? You wake to the muted light of a highland morning, which, in winter, is never quite full daylight. It is pale and diffused, as if the sun itself is reluctant to step into the cold. Your breath still fogs in the air, and the first sensation is of the stiff chill in your fingers, despite having kept them wrapped deep inside the folds of your blanket. The fire in the great hall has long since died down to little more than embers, blackened wood glowing faintly under the ash. The silence is heavy, save for the occasional crackle of settling timbers in the rafters and the distant, lonely cry of a bird somewhere beyond the keep walls. The first task, before anything else, is rekindling warmth. The keep stone absorbs the cold and holds it for days, and the hearths are the only source of resistance against it. A servant, bundled in wool from head to foot, is already on their knees in front of the fire pit, coaxing it back to life with thin strips of pine kindling. And breath, you watch as their gloved hands work slowly, no sudden movements, no rush, because haste in the cold only wastes effort. The ritual of firelighting in such a place is almost ceremonial. The slow arrangement of sticks, the careful placement of a single glowing ember rescued from last night, and then the patient waiting for the faint curl of smoke to turn into the sharper scent of burning wood. Food is the next consideration. There is no fresh bread. The last batch was baked 3 days ago, and it is already hard at the edges. Ale, stored in barrels deep in the storeroom where the temperature never changes, will be served lukewarm because there is no reason to chill what the stone already keeps cold. Oats are measured into the iron pot with the same rhythm they have been measured for generations. Salt, a precious and traded commodity here, is added sparingly. The meal will be filling, but plain something to keep a body going through hours of slow, steady work, not to delight the tongue. The keep's daily rhythm is unhurried but unrelenting. The outer gate must be checked. Frost can seize the hinges, making it dangerous if it needs to be shut in haste. The walls must be walked to look for loose stones or signs of weathering. And though the snow sometimes hides the damage, ignoring it will only make it worse. Water must be fetched from the well, a task that sounds simple until you feel the wind cut across the courtyard, and your fingers ache before the bucket even touches the pulley rope. Every movement in this climate is weighed against the cost in warmth and energy. There are no wasted trips, no unnecessary errands. Inside the keep, you notice the layered life of the place. The air smells faintly of smoke, wool, and drying herbs that hang from the rafters in bunches. Every piece of cloth curtains, wall hangings, blankets is both decorative and practical, adding insulation to otherwise bare stone. People move in a manner that feels almost measured, keeping their bodies close to the heat of the hearth whenever possible. Even conversation is subdued, voices low so as not to carry too far in the cavernous space. By midday, light from the narrow arrow slits shifts slightly, casting longer shadows against the hall's central table. The keep is quiet, except for the occasional thud of wood being split in the yard. Somewhere in the tower, a child coughs, the sound echoing softly down the stairwell. In winter, illness is feared more than the cold itself. A fever in this place can turn quickly dangerous when remedies are limited to herbal brews and rest. There is no illusion here about comfort. The stone walls are protection, but they are also a kind of trap in winter, sealing you into an enclosed, unchanging world of grey and chill. Outside, the highlands stretch into misty slopes, the heather long, dead for the season, the streams edged with ice. Inside, life becomes a practice in endurance, each day blending into the next with only small variations, striping a roof slate that has slipped, grinding more oats for storage, mending the leather straps on the gate. And yet, despite the monotony, there is security in the rhythm. No matter how sharp the wind becomes, the walls do not yield. No matter how long the night feels, there is always someone tending the embers until morning comes again. It is this balance between isolation and protection, between hardship and stability that defines life here. But as the afternoon draws to a close and the light begins its early retreat, you are left to wonder what happens when the protection of these walls is tested by more than just the cold. With the same stone that guards against frost also stand firm against the threats that walk on two legs. By the time March came in the year of 1487, the Highland winter had begun its slow retreat, though to the people inside the keep, it was less a retreat and more a cautious negotiation with the elements. The snow still lay in hard, wind-smoothed drifts along the shaded side of the outer wall. The roofs groaned under the final heavy frost. In the mornings, the ground outside still cracked under boots. But inside the keep, something had shifted, not only in the temperature, but in the mood of the people. For nearly half a year, they had lived with the sound of the wind keening against the stone, and the sight of white hills rolling away into nothingness. The great hall's fire had burned day and night, but no one forgot the feel of damp chill in their bones after leaving it. By late winter, the thick smell of smoke was so embedded in every cloak, tunic, and hair that the people hardly noticed it anymore. But the days were fractionally longer now, and the hens had begun laying again small signs, but deeply felt. Yet survival in the keep's final weeks of winter was not a matter of waiting idly for the thaw. These weeks were often the hardest, for the stores were lowest now, the people leaner, and the risk of sickness highest. Old records of Highland life mention the hungry gap, those late winter months before spring crops could be planted, when last year's harvest was nearly gone, and the New Year's food was still only a hope in the storerooms. Barley sacks that had once stood chest-high now sagged in the middle. The dried peas and beans were counted daily. Even the oatcakes, so tough they could last for months, were breaking into smaller portions. Salted meat, kept in barrels in the coldest corner, was trimmed with more precision than ever, and each piece was boiled to soften it, making broth that was poured into everyone's cup. The keep's commander, an aging chieftain's brother named Donnell, was the one who watched the ledgers and paced the halls with a frown. He was not cruel, but his duty was to make the food last, and his word was final. When a boy in the kitchens was caught sneaking a strip of dried venison, Donald did not whip him, but made him stand beside the hearth all day with the meat tied to his belt, uneaten, as a warning to others. The boy never tried again. Outside the keep, life was no easier for the herds. In the byre, the cattle were lean from the long winter, their breaths steaming in the cold air. Sheep in the surrounding fields had been driven closer in, kept on the lower slopes where the snow melted first, but even there they poured through the icy ground for scraps of grass. Those whose wool was too thin would not last much longer. The keep's women, in quiet consultation, decided to slaughter 2 more sheep early rather than watch them die and waste the meat. And always there was the cold. Even in March, a highland wind could cut through layers of wool as if it were bare skin. The guards on the wall knew that the slowest hour of any day was the last before dawn. That was when the cold seemed to deepen, seeping even into the marrow of the bones. When the fire's heat faded and frost grew along the inside edges of their helmets, the night watch became a test of endurance as much as duty. The final watch of the winter belonged to an older guard named Murdoch, who had served in the keep since before the youngest were born. His eyes were pale and watery, but his ears caught the smallest creak in the snow. He moved slowly, conserving his steps, leaning into the wind without fighting it. From the wall walk, the land spread out in a vast stillness. On some nights, the moonlight shone so clearly that Murdoch swore he could see the glint of frozen streams miles away. On others, snow fell so thick that the outer gate disappeared in the white. For Murdoch, the watch was never boring. It was a litany of sounds: the groan of timbers as the wind pressed, the whimper of the hunting dogs in their kennels, the faint rustle of hay in the byre. In those sounds was the pulse of the keep's life, and he knew that if any sound went wrong, the sudden clatter of a loosened gate, the sharp cry of a startled animalit could mean danger. But not all danger in late winter came from raiders or wolves. More often, it came from within, fever. It began in the smallest way, with one servant woman coughing over the bread dough. By the end of the week, 3 others were down with it. The keep's healer, a bent woman named Fiona, insisted on keeping the sick in a small chamber away from the great hall. She boiled pine needles in water and made them drink it, claiming it would open their chests. The rest of the keep muttered prayers and avoided the room. Illness could spread fast in the still, smoky air of a shut-in winter. The smoke from the fire kept out some damp, but it also meant the rooms were rarely truly fresh. Bedding was hung outside when the weather allowed, but for weeks at a time that was impossible. Still, Fiona kept her patients breathing, and no one else fell ill. As the thaw began in earnest, the keep's people turned their minds to the work of opening the year. Tools that had been stored in the loft were brought down and sharpened: spades, hoes, sickles. The great wooden plough yoke was inspected for cracks. Sheep were sheared early if the weather allowed. It meant less protection from the cold for them, but the wool could be spun while the women waited for the earth to soften. There was no great celebration at the end of the winter, only a slow easing. One day the stream outside the keep could be heard under its ice. Another day the hens wandered farther from their coop. The cattle lowed more often, sensing grass under the snow. And one evening the great horse fire was allowed to burn lower than usual, just enough to warm the stones, but not enough to fight a bitter frost. It was the first time since autumn that the people dared to think the cold might be ending. Murdoch, on his final watch of the winter, looked out across the dark slopes and saw a thin ribbon of mist rising from the stream. It was nothing much, just the breath of warmer water against colder air, but to him it was the certain sign that the keep had survived another season. Inside, the sound of quiet laughter rose from the hall, where the people spoke of planting, of lambing, of the first green shoots. And though the stone walls were still cold to the touch, there was in them now a memory of all the winters they had endured, and all they would endure still. But perhaps the harder question, one that no one spoke aloud, was this: if the keep's walls had kept out the cold, what else had they kept in, winter after winter, that might never be let out?